Well, hello and an extremely warm welcome to my channel. I'm Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses. A warm welcome if you're a returning viewer and an equally warm welcome if you are viewing my channel for the very first time. So exciting, this is the first reading wrap up of this year, 2025. And I've done some quite hefty reading, I'd say, over the last month. And some of it I'm struggling to remember, which is a bit weird. I don't know whether it's because I've just spent 3 weeks or so in Sri Lanka having an amazing adventure out there, and have returned to sort of start thinking hard about the books that I read before I left. It seems a lifetime ago. But anyway, the first book that I read in 2025 was The Winter Spirits. Now, I was really looking forward to this. I bought this well over a year ago when Simon and I visited the wonderful Harris and Harris bookshop in Clare in Suffolk, run by the lovely Kate. And this book is called The Winter Spirits. I think I might have said that already, so apologies. I don't know why I'm rushing, but I seem to be. And the cover really attracted me, as you can see. It's very Christmassy and lovely. And I thought it would be great to curl up over the winter season with some ghostly tales for frosty nights, which is what the blurb says on the spine of the book. And also there are some really, some writers in here that I've read before. So I was very much looking forward to seeing the short story format from some of those writers' points of view. But actually, I found this really quite disappointing. I think there was a real sort of sameness about the stories in this collection, and the authors that I had read before, their stories didn't necessarily, even though they were authors I really loved, the stories didn't necessarily leap out at me. So it's all a bit of a blur. And I can't say that there were many of these stories that I really felt were really good. There was one, I can't remember what it's called, but it was by an author called Natasha Pullian. I don't think I've read anything by her before. Is it called Salt? Something like that. The Salt Miracles. And I thought that was really clever. It really stood out from the rest of the collection because it was about this island and all these strange salt figures start appearing on the island. And there was a sort of... It was a bit more unique, I think, because a lot of these stories were about clairvoyance, or I don't know, there's old family houses. It seemed, I think I was expecting perhaps, I don't know, ghost stories that were a little bit different, maybe a little bit sci-fi or a bit unusual. And I think if you like a good cozy gothic Victorian style story, then you'll enjoy this. And I think maybe, it's my fault for expecting something different. Maybe I was thinking it did more than what it says on the tin. So I don't know. But for me, not a brilliant read. Next up is Gita Mehta's River Sutra, which was my book of the month because it was I just thought it was extraordinary. It was really unlike anything I've read before. It focuses on an Indian civil servant who's gone to retire into the countryside and have a quiet life. And he sort of ends up doing anything but, because he meets a series of characters who sort of tell him or confess their stories to him. For example, there's a teacher who's committed a murder. And I love this book because it's run through with music, lots of musical references. The river flows through it. It's set in Rajasthan, which I'm visiting later in the year, so from a very selfish perspective, I thought that was interesting. And I also didn't realise until I'd posted the video about this as my book of the month. I'd said it read like short stories, and some of you lovely commentators mentioned that they thought that actually it was presented as a series of short stories, and that kind of makes sense to me now. And unlike the previous book, these stories were all quirky and different, even though they were all by the same author. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this novel, and what a beautiful cover there is on the front of this book. And then I read Summerwater by Sarah Moss, and I would describe this as an absolute masterpiece. I can't believe that I'm only in the first month of the year, and yet I've already read several books now, which I think could be my books of the year. So if the year is going to continue in that vein, happy days is what I say. So this is Sarah Moss. I think this is quite maybe her most recent one before her recent memoir, I'm not sure. So she, this was published a good few years ago now, I suspect. And what's really clever about it is that it's set beside a Scottish loch, and it's a series of holiday cabins, and in each cabin there are different people, obviously, because it's a holiday place. So you've got, I don't know, middle-aged couples, you've got youngsters have only just got together, you've got families, and the novel takes a glimpse. You get snapshots of a character living within one of those, or holidaying within one of those scenarios, and sometimes there's crossover between the narration. So each section is narrated by a different person, and yet the novel, I mean, the structure of it is really clever, because the novel arc takes place over the course of just one day, and there is constant rain. The rain just never stops. It's a real feature of this novel. It's absolutely beautifully written, and it really exposes the pressure that holidays put us under. There's a pressure to enjoy yourself. There's a pressure to explore new things. There's a pressure to spend time sort of staring into the distance and not doing anything at all. And she really reveals the psychology of the different characters she presents in very few words. It's beautifully written. I can really picture the setting, even though it's a while since I read it. I think this is absolute genius. I really loved this book. Oh, and one thing I will say as well is that it's what I would call a very still book, where in a sense not an awful lot happens, but I thought the ending was really brilliant as well. So there you go, there's a teaser in case you haven't read it already. And then just before I went off on my jolly holidays, I picked this beauty up, which Simon bought me for my birthday. I think this is I know this is an imported copy from Australia, and it's called Dusk, and it's by the wonderful Robbie Arnott, who just seems to get better and better and better. He's only a relatively young Australian author, and my goodness, this novel, it's absolutely mind-blowing. Similar to the Sarah Moss novel, there is so much in here. It tells the story of twins, Iris and Flynn, and they are growing up in Australia under the shadow of their parents' misdemeanours. Their parents were convicts who were shipped over to Australia from Europe, and so they come from this allegedly civilised world, but the conditions on the boat that they're shipped over on are so horrendous that they both become addicted to alcohol. And so once they arrive in Australia, they just take up a string of, when I say take up, that's the wrong word. They turn their hands to anything. They thieve, they lie, they steal. And somewhere along the line, they have these twin children. And the children are just battling against their parents' reputation the whole of their lives. And by the time we meet them, they've sort of held themselves together by turning their hands to just about anything, mainly manual labour of one sort or another. They're both on horseback. One of the twins, Flynn, he's got something wrong with his back, which becomes really important later on in the story. And they're travelling from pillar to post, and they hear about this puma called Dusk, which is terrorising the area of Australia that they're in, and there's a bounty on its head. So they decide that they are going to go and hunt this puma. And oh my goodness, the landscape, the writing is beautiful. There's a pace to it. There's almost the rhythm of the horse footfall as you're reading through the novel, and they encounter this very enigmatic character who becomes really, really important as well to the story. So even though, you know, the story is written in the third person, but it's very much really close over Iris's shoulder, so you're sort of seeing the world mainly from her point of view, and you've got to know them quite well before this. There's then a fourth character who's brought in right towards the end, who again becomes really important. But even though that character's brought in at the last minute, Robbie Arnott is so skillful that you get really invested in this new character as well. And I just am such an admirer of what he does. And as ever with his writing, the environment's really, really important. The natural world. There's also a very fascinating episode where Iris goes to an indigenous community to find work, and yeah, Arnott's got some very interesting things to say about that as well, which seems to be again a consistent theme in his writing. So yeah, I really urge you to read this. It's a really, really powerful, fantastic novel, and oh my goodness, the ending again, whoa. And then I went off on my jolly holes, and I decided that I wasn't going to take many books, but I was going to take meaty books. So the first novel that I read while I was away was, which bizarrely, considering I was in, a very, very hot climate, I decided to take C.J. Sansom's Winter in Madrid. Maybe I thought I needed something to cool me down in the heat. And I've read 3 now of C.J. Sansom's, that's hard to say, Shard Lake series, which are they're sort of detective novels, I suppose, set in Tudor England, with Shard Lake, the lawyer, as their main character, and I've become really, really fond of those. So I kind of knew that the chances were I was going to really enjoy this book, which of course is always important when you're picking a book to take on holiday, because you don't want to lug around something like this and not enjoy it. So I would describe this as it's a slow burner to start with and then becomes a real page turner. So by the end of it, I absolutely couldn't put it down. It's set in 1940, so during the Second World War in Madrid, and it focuses on several characters actually. So there's a man called Bernie who goes out to fight for the communists, and at the beginning of the novel, there's a gun pointed at him. And has he or has he not been shot? So his character kind of looms over the novel, as it were. Then there's the character of Barbara, who was in love with Bernie, and she worked for the Red Cross. So she's in Madrid with her new, well, not new, but with a different partner called Sandy. And Sandy is a really, really interesting character. And at the beginning of the novel, after we've learnt about Bernie, Harry comes into the story, and he is recruited in Britain to go out and spy on Sandy. And he doesn't have the conventional profile of a spy. He does speak fluent Spanish, which means he can pose as a translator for the British Embassy, but he hasn't really got enough of the qualities. There's not much guile to him. So that kind of puts him in a position of jeopardy out there. And the thing that connects Bernie and Sandy and Harry, and therefore by default Barbara, is that the 3 men all went to the same school, and their relationship was difficult in the sense that 2 of them were very close friends, 2 of them were not. One of them was bullied by the other. So it's really interesting so you sort of, you get all this backstory of their life in this English public school called Rookwood, I think. And then you get the sort of revelation of their characters as adults and how that affects their situation in Franco's Spain. And that's the other thing that I loved about this novel, is that it's an education. You know, I learned a lot more about the Franco regime. I learned about much more about, you know, the sort of communist sympathizers who went out to fight. I learned a lot about the British, all the sort of shenanigans and diplomacy that went on in terms of, you know, at this point in the story, they don't know whether Franco is going to side with Hitler. Hitler's flying over to Madrid to try and sort of negotiate with Franco. So all the kind of brinksmanship that's going on between these different countries in terms of how to proceed during the war, I found fascinating. So yeah, it was a really good book to take on holiday, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then finally, I took with me Romola by George Eliot. Now, I bought this, I think, I'm trying to think where I was. I might have been in Oxford. Have I written it down inside? No. I don't think I knew that George Eliot had written this book. And it's not her final novel. It's not her first novel. It comes towards the end of her writing career. And George Eliot's Middlemarch is one of my favourite ever novels. So I thought, well, it's really surprising that I haven't come across this novel before. So I thought, well, it's a big, hefty read. It's got lots of words in it. I love George Eliot. I'll take it with me. And when I started reading it, I thought it was a huge mistake, because it took me well over 100 pages to really get into this novel. There is this very long-winded proem, which is a term from kind of classical literature at the beginning, a sort of introduction, which I found really complex. You know, I almost DNF'd it on holiday, which would have been a huge sacrifice because I only had one other book with me as an alternative anyway. But I am really, really glad that I persevered, because I ended up thoroughly enjoying this novel. It gets pacier and pacier as it proceeds. I'm not necessarily recommending it. I think it's a very intellectual book. I think it's really academic. I think George Eliot is being semi-didactic in the way that she is telling this story and her reasons for telling it. So anyway, Romola is a young woman living in Florence. So the novel starts in 1492 and it spans about 6 years of history. And it's clear that I think Eliot had been to Florence. I think she loved Italy. I know she spoke fluent Italian. So I think she perhaps chose Florence as a place that she kind of wanted to spend time in that imaginary world. And I suppose in some ways Florence of the 1490s was not dissimilar to the Victorian society that she was growing up with. All sorts of questions about the treatment of women, questions about the imposition of religion, and also actually the threat of France as a threat, because the French invade Italy at the point in which this novel's written. So it kind of makes sense for Eliot to be looking at Florence as a parallel with her own world. And Romola is a young woman growing up with her father in Florence. She's well educated, but she is without agency. So despite the fact that he's educated really well, her father is very dismissive of her because she is female. He loves her and he needs her because he's gone blind, and she is his eyes, basically. She reads to him. He's a man of letters. So her world is really confined, and into that world comes the character of Tito, who is a young Greek man, extremely attractive. He has all this curly hair. It's described as hyacinthine, and he seems very much like Odysseus from the Odyssey to me. I mean, his Homer compares Odysseus's hair to Hyacinth's at one point in the story, and I feel like she's got Odysseus in her head when she's creating the character of Tito, because he also is not particularly trustworthy. And Odysseus, of course, is a consummate liar. And Tito turns up in Florence. He's been shipwrecked. He's got some gems to sell. and he encounters a hairdresser and various other characters who sort of show him around initially and take him under their wing, because he's really charming and he has the gift of the gab. He's very persuasive. And he and Romola meet, and this love story ensues between them. But it's really complex, and I can't say too much more about the plot without giving things away, so I don't really want to do that. Now, the other thing that really interested me about this novel is that there is a lot of the intellectuals and the priests and so on that roam the streets in this story are real characters from the history of Florence, and one of them is a man called Savonarola, who you may have heard of. There's a really quite intimidating and unpleasant portrait of him, which is very famous, where his head is kind of covered with a black hood, and he's got very sort of pointed features, and he looks a bit demonic. But in some ways, this is a novel just as much about him and his sort of religious zeal and the power that he gains over Florence as it is about Romola herself. And there's a point in the novel where they have this encounter which becomes very important to Romola. So she becomes really influenced by him. And again, I found that whole sort of the whole historical backdrop. That's why I'm saying it's a very academic novel in lots of ways, because Eliot clearly had done a tremendous amount of research, and she doesn't exactly ram it down your throat, but you are quite conscious of this book sort of almost trying to educate you as you read, which I think would be a real turn off for a lot of people. So I am not commending this novel to you. I think if you are somebody who is of an academic bent, somebody who is prepared to wade through the first 100 pages without much reward and then go on to really get something from this novel, go ahead and read it. And I would be really, really interested to see whether any of you wonderful viewers have encountered this novel and have, and what your thoughts about it are, because on balance, I really enjoyed it. But as you can see, it was hard work. So there you go. They are my reads for January 2025. I will just add that Dusk was the book that I chose for the Savage Prompts, the 2025 prompts. So the prompt for January was to read a book with about twins, which features twins, and of course you've got Iris and Flynn, the twins, in the novel, so it's absolutely perfect for that prompt. And February's prompt is to read a book that has a body of water in the title, and I've already chosen mine, but I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. I'm hoping, I know a lot of you have sort of requested that Simon and I share our thoughts about the prompts, and we've had some lovely ideas from some of you about how we might do that, and also talk about some of the books that you lot are all reading, so kind of collate what we're learning about that. And I am intending, my plan is to go ahead and do that. However, I know that in the next few days an enormous box is going to arrive at my house, and inside that box are going to be the long listed books for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, and I have committed myself to reading those. So I know that my time over February, I think I've got about 6 weeks, maybe just over 5 weeks in which to read those books, and there will probably be 16 of them, and some of them might be quite hefty. So I'm eagerly awaiting the postman's arrival, but I'm also conscious that I don't know how much time realistically I'm going to have to report back on other things. So I will try and make a prompt video, at least one, but we shall see how we go. So anyway, I hope you lovely people had a wonderful reading January. I am now off to edit this video because I've got to head out a bit later into the big wild world. I'm sorry if the light's been a bit weird today because the sun's very bright and it's a little bit difficult in this room to engineer things so that, I'm not getting dots floating around. I think some of you've commented on that before. Remember, I'm not a professional. I'm just doing this for fun. Anyway, take care, all of you. Happy reading, and hopefully speak to you very, very soon. Bye.